It is impossible to mention the end of the 1980s glitz and glam without also mentioning the grunge movement of the 1990s. A single Nirvana music video on MTV changed the cultural zeitgeist seemingly overnight. In response to this, many big bands from the 80s changed their sound so drastically that it gave their fans a case of whiplash, while other artists were able to transition more naturally. In this video, I would like to take a look at how some major artists from the 1980s redefined their sound for the 1990s. This is Dancing with Ghosts. First off, I'd like to take a look at the things that seemingly disappeared soon after 1989 transitioned into 1990. In most of the chart-topping songs of the 80s, you had bubbly synthesized bass lines, heavily keyboard-driven melodies, synthesized drum beats made by a drum machine, gang vocals, the recording technique where it sounds like a million people are singing your song along with you. And finally, nearly every sound in the 1980s was drenched in reverb. I guess because the recordings were so dry in the 1970s, producers really wanted to stand out in the decade of decadence by making their music sound like it was being played in a large cathedral. Some of the stalwarts of this decade were acts like Elton John, Sting, Madonna, Genesis, and Michael Jackson, just to name a few. I'll be focusing on these artists for this video as a small cross-section of the various paths these acts took as they were forced to either evolve their sound or get left behind. It seemed like the first option in the new decade of the 90s was for an artist to go adult contemporary. Adult contemporary is a music genre that I feel like was much bigger and more talked about in the 80s and 90s than it is nowadays, but it was a sound defined as easy listening, soft rock, and smooth R&B with some pop sensibility sprinkled in. Now, of course, no self-respecting hipster music journalist is ever going to admit to liking adult contemporary, and it was therefore seen as a lame music genre amongst the masses that were trying to be cool. Elton John definitely pivoted his sound into this direction with the release of his 1992 album, The One. We went from seeing Elton prancing through the 80s with all the upbeat peppiness of a cocaine-fueled carnival barker to the somber, sepia-toned Elton of the 1990s. By the time 1992 hit, Elton John's music and image seemed to transition into a darker, more minor sound. Honestly, other than the classic music he made in the 1970s, the 90s is my favorite period for Elton John's music. Sting is another example of an artist from the 1980s who went the adult contemporary route. Fronting the massively popular new wave band The Police, Sting parted ways with the group in the mid-80s to pursue a more experimental sound. But by 1993's Ten Summoners Tales, we can see Sting firmly plant his roots into the, quote, easy-listening, soft-rocked sound with the smash hits Fields of Gold and If I Ever Lose My Faith in You. And from what I can tell, Sting has been sticking to the adult contemporary route ever since. But I'm an old man, so I gotta say, I really like Sting's music a lot. My final example of a band that went the adult contemporary route is also one of my favorite bands of all time, and that would be Genesis. Genesis had hit their 80s synth-pop zenith with 1986's Invisible Touch. But by 1991's We Can't Dance, it sounded like the band was ready to take a nap. Now, I'm not saying this was a bad album by any means, but their sound had become noticeably more docile. And again, what was up with the sepia tones in those early 90s music videos? I hate sepia tone, and I feel like it only makes sense in those mock-up old western photos people get at Disney World. For rock bands that found their stride in the 1980s, the grunge sound became a big problem, because it was a dialect of rock that they did not speak. But they would have to learn it if they wanted to remain relevant going into the 1990s. Some did better than others. Kiss made a huge comeback in the 1980s after deciding to take off their face paint and conform to the sounds that were popular at the time. Hair metal was the choice du jour of rock music, so the band changed accordingly, and fans bought it. For a time. As the 90s came and went, however, Kiss saw their career fall back into yet another slump. Bass player Gene Simmons, in all his typical hubris, thought the only solution was to change their sound yet again. So Kiss made a grunge record in 1997, years after the popularity of grunge had faded away. Good move, guys. The band would only regain favor with the fans by becoming a nostalgia act, putting the makeup back on and reuniting with founding members Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, only to kick them out again a few years later. Progressive rock band Rush had a very commercially successful run in the 1980s, implementing more and more of a plastic synthetic sound that was seen as the norm at the time. Rush was slowly replacing most traditional rock instruments in favor of synthesizers and electronic drum pads, but all that changed in 1993 when Rush dropped the album Counterparts. Counterparts was a very transparent attempt at Rush's version of grunge, and though they may not have pulled it off, I feel like it was still a great record. Rush's entire philosophy is constant evolution, so after Counterparts, the band continued further down the hard rock path, sadly ditching most of the synthesizers. I actually really love Rush's 1980s synth rock period. That's just me. As I discuss the changing of the cultural zeitgeist, I would be remiss not to bring up the blast crater-sized impact that hip-hop had on the mainstream of the 1990s. The rise of this genre greatly influenced many of the well-known pop stars of the 1980s. But easily the biggest megastar to be influenced by hip-hop was Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was the biggest pop star phenom, arguably, of all time. But he straight up owned the 1980s when it came to hit records. But as the youth started turning to more harder-edged music like grunge and gangster rap, the 1990s saw Michael Jackson's relevance slowly waning. Unfortunately, we also can't discuss the King of Pop without bringing up the various scandals that followed him throughout his entire career. With rumors of skin bleaching, child endangerment, and being a homosexual, because I guess that was a bad thing back in the 90s, it seemed as though Jackson entered the 90s in way more of a pissed-off mood than the fun dance party vibe of the 1980s. With the 1991 release of Michael Jackson's Dangerous, we see the pop star attempt to get edgy. To me, it always just kind of felt like a character who was playing a part. With songs like Why You Wanna Trip on Me, In the Closet, and Black and White, Michael Jackson attempts to simultaneously address rumors, promote racial unity, and prove his relevance. Michael Jackson definitely had some decent releases in the 1990s, but most of the songs just felt like try-hard attempts to keep up with the next generation of pop stars. When he wasn't trying to keep up with the culture, he was writing bitter response songs directed at his critics, which I feel like wasn't the Michael Jackson everyone grew up loving. Jackson would keep putting out pop records throughout the 90s and early 2000s, but the albums would never quite capture the attention and acclaim the way his 1980s albums did. So far, we've discussed the various paths that artists and megastars of the 1980s took while transitioning into the 1990s, but one artist that I would like to highlight seemed to only get better and more relevant with age. Starting off as your typical 1980s teen pop singer, Madonna really did blaze her own trail of art pop. Madonna started off with a saccharine pop sound in the early 1980s, but with each new album, the Madonna character grew edgier and more interesting. By 1992, Madonna had arguably become bigger than ever with the release of the album Erotica. Around the same time, Madonna released her controversial book titled Sex. I won't get into the book in this video, but needless to say, it helped Madonna maintain her edge in the 1990s more sex-driven pop climate. It seemed like any time the culture tried to write off Madonna as a has-been, she would release a hit record. Madonna rode that razor-thin line of keeping up with the times by innovating and staying fresh. Mad props to her for that. It's pretty interesting to just step back and see how much of a difference a decade can make in pop culture. Fads die out. New fads take their place. Sounds and production techniques that were hip just 5 years ago have now aged like a fine milk, and the youth are craving for something different. And as an artist, you have to either innovate and evolve, or you become a nostalgia act. Just as a side note as I end this video, there were way more bands, way more artists that I could have included in this video, but I wanted to keep it relatively short. So let me know in the comments, because I'm sure you have some suggestions. What are some artists that you saw a major change from going from the 80s to the 90s? I'm sure there's some glaring omissions here. I've also done several videos about prog rock and alternative rock, and even how rock bands from the 70s changed going into the 80s. And those videos should be popping up around me. Make sure you comment on this video, like it, share it, all that great stuff. Ring the notification bell. Put a lot of work into this one, so I hope you really enjoyed it. And yeah, until next time, you have a good rest of your night. You know why I say have a good rest of your night instead of day? Because this channel, I imagined myself, people should be watching it at night as they're chilling out, drinking, smoking, whatever, you know, then they put on the video. So that's why I always say have a good night, because I want you to watch these videos at night. Anyway, bye.